What I'm doing here is completely legal, but scientifically difficult. This is my giant cloud rainforest floor vivarium I call Pandora, which is connected via this glass bridge to a whole other giant vivarium above, called Orchidia, simulating the rainforest's tree canopy. Together they form a tropical ecosystem involving a vast plethora of creatures, plants, and one of my personal favorites, fungi. And being the fun guy for fun guy that I am, I've been cooking up the ultimate plan. In the name of science, of course, a growing operation of epic proportions. There's a type of mushroom that is very special. They aren't quite psychedelic mushrooms, but there's an even more valuable mushroom species that I've been privately studying for years now that has been stumping scientists forever. Meet Termitomyces, a highly prized edible mushroom that we humans have been relishing for millennia, but have not yet been able to grow agriculturally, like most other edible mushrooms. To this day, if we want to eat these tasty, nutrient-dense, thought to be by many cultures medicinal mushrooms, we need to venture out and collect them when they sprout after a tropical rainstorm from the tops of termite mounds, hence their name. You see, the termites, belonging to the genus Macrotermes, that actively grow this fungus as a food source, possess the secret sauce and ancient knowledge to successfully cultivate the underground fungus combs that give rise to the Termitomyces mushrooms. The termite workers carefully calibrate complex architectural structures within their nests in response to temperature fluctuations that create the perfect microclimates for this highly prized fungus to thrive. I collected a comb from a termite mound in my yard a couple years back, but in a container like this, without the termites to tend to it, the fungus comb died in a day. For ages, scientists have been trying to understand how to mass grow these highly valuable mushrooms in a lab, but we still haven't quite figured it out. For years, I've been trying to grow these special termite shrooms by cultivating colonies of the fungus-growing termites themselves in various test setups. But year after year, I failed at every attempt, with the termite colonies and the fungus combs failing to survive. I came close 2 years ago, but at a certain point the fungus died out. I was missing a secret piece of the puzzle. But this time, I felt I finally had the missing piece. I have suspicions that one can't just isolate the termites in a sterile petri dish and try to get them to grow the mushrooms. My theory now is that you need an entire ecosystem to do it. And this year, I had the perfect simulation of a tropical forest in my home. So the chances to be the first in the world to grow Termitomyces mushrooms indoors were in our favor more than ever before. Ladies and gents, prepare to be mind-blown by a biological journey into this unseen dimension of the micro world and my Termitomyces mushroom growing operation using a colony of termites and an entire rainforest ecosystem in my home to do it. Welcome to the AntsCanada Ant Channel. Please subscribe to my channel and hit the bell icon. Welcome to the AC fam. Enjoy. Fungi have been called the dark matter of terrestrial life. They seem to play critical roles throughout global ecosystems. But according to the World Agroforestry Center, we humans still know little about them. Though past fieldwork has yielded promising results, we continue to know little or even nothing about the vast majority of fungal species populating our planet, including the most mysterious of all, the Termitomyces mushroom. Our story begins here, when I spotted the most incredible sight. Wide-eyed, I marveled at the ever-elusive creatures of our rainforest, the great OG termites, whom we've only spotted a handful of times because they rarely show themselves, most especially during the day like this. This was certainly a rare occasion. These are Termites, a wood-eating species of termite that have been here since the start of this rainforest project, having been transported into here via the huge stump on which they were now constructing the the most amazing tunnel. The workers were constructing this tunnel using their poop as a building material. So this tube they were building was a poop tube, a protective tunnel that once hardened would allow the colony members to travel to other areas of the stump undisturbed. There were many creatures in the rainforest that loved eating termites, so this poop tube needed to be built. But in order to do that, the workers had to be exposed for just a few hours, in which time special soldier termites with pointy guns on their heads, which can shoot out a nauseous defensive sticky fluid, stood guard among the worker lines. I was so happy to see the colony was still alive and thriving, even after 8 months since their transport here, which meant their king and queen, who also lived somewhere inside the stump, were healthy. I watched them build the tunnels over several hours. And soon, the tunnel had been completed. Now these Termites termites are not the species of termites that I needed to grow our Termitomyces mushrooms. These termites are a species that eat and nest in wood and were smaller in size. The fungus-growing termites that I needed, known scientifically as Macrotermes gilvis, were introduced into Pandora about a month ago, when I threw in a whole bunch of queens and kings who were eager to pair up and cooperatively found new colonies underground. A ton were eaten by the tree frogs, but some managed to survive and burrow into the soil. And ever since then, I've been waiting eagerly to see signs of the first workers emerging above ground to begin the intricate fungus growing process. Little did I know, the long wait was soon about to be over, and the fun was just about to begin. But meanwhile, I had some business to attend to regarding a certain new baby I spotted last week living in our rainforest. The new baby sun skink crawled out from a hole in the driftwood and began to wander. Until it slipped below a carpet of moss. It had been born from adult sun skinks, which used to live in the forest, but that I released back into the wild a few weeks back. Seeing this baby sun skink had confirmed my suspicions that they had been breeding, and I didn't know how many of these babies were actually living here. But it was just so cute. It measured about an inch long, such a tiny little guy, and was very active. It was hunting for little insects to feed on. Every time it disappeared below the moss carpet, I could track its whereabouts as it moved as a lump beneath the moss. Now, one thing I noticed about this little one was that its tail had been snipped. It was then that I decided to call him Snip. These skinks are capable of dropping their tails in the face of a predator attempting to catch them. So perhaps this sun skink already had an altercation with one of the resident predators in the rainforest. Now, my first instinct was to remove the little one from the rainforest and raise it in its own tank somewhere. But after some thought, I realized that keeping it inside the vivarium, where it would learn to hunt and evade predators, was essential to this sun skink's development if I did release it into the wild one day, just like I did its parents. I had no intention of keeping it forever as my personal pet, just another member of the rainforest that would eventually grow up to be a top predator and teach us about its place in the ecosystem. After basking on the driftwood for a while, Snip crawled and leaped away to hide somewhere below ground. But in total contrast to Snip, there was another member of the rainforest, a very controversial creature who had quite recently assumed Snip's parents' throne as top predator of our rainforest, whom I did have intentions of keeping as a pet. A tiny fly landed on Godzilla's snout, drinking its tears, which were full of valuable salts and minerals. But while the fly was feeding, I was feeding Godzilla. and threw him a live roach, which he eventually took. Watching our resident baby caiman eat was always so satisfying. Swallowing down an entire roach was quite the process for him, as it took several rounds of active management to work the roach into just the right position in his mouth to slide down his throat. Godzilla right now could only manage swallowing things the size of an adult roach at this age, which made me a bit nervous, seeing as now there were baby sun skinks running around the rainforest. But I later realized that if Godzilla did manage to catch them, I had to accept that this was all part of the ecosystem ecosysteming. But as he continued to work with the roach, I noticed something on his face. It was a scar. Do you see it? It was healing over now and appeared as a slight discoloration. Crocodilian skin is made up of specialized scales called osteoderms, which are bony scutes that help protect the croc from injury. But croc skin is very fast healing if it does get punctured. So where did this scar come from? I also wondered where. But the rainforest was full of places he could acquire nicks and scrapes from, like the sharp thorns on some of the plants, or perhaps a squabble with a crab while eating it, a bite from a huntsman, or a sharp rock. Now Godzilla here was captive bred and was intended to be a pet caiman. However, instead of protecting him completely from the rainforest's dangers, he too needed to learn the ways of the rainforest, as he would eventually be moving outside to my 60-foot outdoor pond and sunken garden, where he would need to contend with similar outdoor forces. But at the same time, I needed to start socializing and taming Godzilla out at this age, like I would any other pet, because once these crocs get to their full size of about 5 feet, they become dangerous and difficult to work around if they hadn't learned through their lifetime that humans are friends. So far, the socialization process was going well, and he has now gotten to learn my face, the sound of my voice, and associate my presence with getting food. Good, Godzilla. Rest well now. Looking at his belly, it seems he has done a great job so far at catching all the food he needed from the rainforest. I began to wonder if there were baby sun skinks in there too. I also began to wonder if Godzilla was responsible for Snip's missing tail end. I guess we would find out in time. But meanwhile, little did I know, other unforeseen dangers were brewing, and a mass disaster of sorts was about to happen that I could have never predicted, that would affect every terrestrial creature in Pandora. It's officially typhoon season in Southeast Asia where I live, and several of these giant rotating storms, equivalent to hurricanes, bringing wind, rain, and destruction every year, come rolling through. During such typhoons, my yard experiences some flooding, and it can rain for days and days on end. The plants and trees in my area love it, and the wildlife are adapted to dealing with such periodic flooding events. But one morning, I woke up to this. No! Off! The new irrigation system connected directly to my water pipes coming from a well that I had recently installed since the construction of Arcadia, so I could sync their rain schedules, malfunctioned. And I learned later from a technician that the timer had broken, which caused it to rain for hours in Pandora, resulting in about 80% of the soil area submerged underwater. I suspect that the typhoon still raging outside must have caused a power outage sometime in the early morning and somehow impacted the timer of the irrigation system. Whatever the case, I could see some creatures were already underwater and drowning. Godzilla was sleeping soundly underwater during this whole fiasco, unfazed, but I completely freaked out. I quickly dug a hole down to the pebbly drainage layer and used a shop vac to suck out all the water I could. I was just afraid the roots of the plants, as well as any trapped creatures below the soil, would die. But at the same time, my biologist brain had hope that our rainforest creatures had their various ways to deal with flooding. There were ants, millions of soil creatures, and of course our Macrotermes termite royals, all raising colonies underground. It took a couple hours to suck out the water until it dropped below the drainage level line. But the big question now was, what had survived? I looked closely into the wet and muddy soils, and to my surprise, indeed, there was life. Lots and lots of life. Isopods, ants, springtails, and mites could be seen crawling all around the surface of the soil. This was all wonderful to see. A flat-backed millipede had emerged and was crawling across the soil surface. Carpenter ants were going about their usual business, collecting food from the vine air roots. I spotted a snail that had grabbed onto one of the vine roots and was using it to climb to safety. Other snails were simply crawling up the glass, as were many other creatures like springtails, and these gross creatures. Land planaria. These planarians are a type of predatory flatworm that eats small creatures. Their slimy body allowed it to stick to the glass as it crawled upwards away from the flood. You could see the creature's two little black eyes and its creepy-looking front end, which was shaped like an elongated head of a fountain pen, kept elevated from the glass, feeling its way around as it moved. Ugh. The thing gives me true shivers. But these land planarians have become a permanent fixture in our rainforest and do have their purpose in the ecosystem as predators to tiny insects. I watched it stop to think about whether it should head back down. So gross. Also emerging was this cute fellow. It was a tiny frog, just under an inch long. I hadn't seen this frog in such a long time, since it randomly appeared in our rainforest in the season finale episode of Season 1. I assumed it had been introduced by way of the plants upon construction. It was just amazing to me that creatures like this frog can live on the DL in our rainforest and go completely unspotted for months. I suppose the flood had brought it out of hiding, which tends to happen with many terrestrial and burrowing frog species. It looked unhappy to be awake though, and decided to crawl into an upper pot where it knew it would be drier. Now I didn't know it at the time, but this wasn't the only surprise amphibian I'd be spotting this week. An interesting appearance or two was soon to come. Earthworms had also begun to make the climb up towards dry land, like this earthworm here, seen crawling among the dwarf ants, who lived inside the stump. Some earthworms were heading back down towards the ground to return to the soil. It was then that I spotted this particular creature making its way through the tunnels within the soil. What is that? It was whitish in color and elongated, possessing multiple appendages. To me, it looked predatory, kind of like a short centipede or something. My guess was it was some kind of predatory beetle larva, perhaps. Any ideas what species this thing might be? It looked menacing. But I think I was most happy to see that these guys were still alive, post-flood. Our gnome ants were crawling along the surface of the soil, completely focused on collecting the plethora of little edible debris and small drowned insects washed up from within the soils by the flood. I was afraid that these gnome ants might have died in the flood, seeing as these ants nest directly in the soils. But it looks to me like they totally had things under control. They're currently running a monopoly, as far as ants go, in Pandoran soils, with workers completely sweeping the surface thoroughly of anything they can eat. But for the first time, I spotted something pretty amazing. There! See it? It's a major. So I still don't know what species these gnome ants are, and they look to me like smaller fire ants. And now that I see that they're polymorphic, i.e. having these larger majors with specialized massive heads for cutting things open. They really reminded me of fire ants. "Outta here, isopod," a worker barked. Looks like they had a bit of an attitude too, like fire ants. Anyone know what species these ants might be? I think it's time we give these gnome-ants a name, as they've proven they could stand the test of time in our forest. Please leave your name suggestions for the gnome-ants in the comments. But now that I knew the ants were okay, my next question now was, were the Macrotermes termite royals okay? I was counting on them to create colonies so I could grow my termite mushrooms in the vivarium. I suspected the termites were adapted to flooding, just like all the other creatures, and that they knew how to deal with flooding of their underground chambers. But I wasn't completely sure. But as I looked around, I noticed this. Yay! The termite royals were alive! And you know how I could tell? See that bulge in the soil? That is a signature termite mound, a baby one. And it was very close to the spot where I had watched a trio of Macrotermes termite royals dig their chamber. To me, this meant the termites had already constructed at least part of their chamber here at higher ground, safe from the flood. This was awesome news, because I was ready for the next step of my shroom growing operation. The next day, when the typhoon had finally passed, Mother Nature did her great work and began to set in motion the mass welcoming of termite mushrooms. All along the streets of my area, vendors were selling loads of freshly collected termite mushrooms that had sprouted from termite mounds in the forest. I rejoiced because this only meant one thing. The first generation of Macrotermes termite workers, born from the royals of the nuptial flight several weeks back, were arriving. Mother Nature has perfectly timed the Termitomyces mushroom season with the arrival of the workers, because the propagation process is truly a natural wonder. So get this. What happens is, once the termite royals create their underground chambers, they raise the first termite workers completely off a self-made nutritious soup regurgitated by the kings and queens that raised them. And when the workers reach the adult stage, they are ready to burrow outside of the nest for the first time to forage for something very important to the survival of the colony. They must collect and eat decaying leaves and wood fibers that contain spores from the Termitomyces mushrooms. And due to nature's perfect timing, this key termite foraging period is also when the mushrooms sprout, triggered by the thunderstorms of rainy season. So once the mushrooms sprout, they release the spores that are carried by winds to cover vast areas where they land on wood and leaf debris. The termites eat this debris, and inside their guts, special microbes and enzymes take over, and the resulting poop is laid out in a cool structure on which sprouts the beginning of the fungus. And so I was giddy and bought a ton of the Termitomyces mushrooms from the vendors. I've laid out some of them here. You can see that there are two species of Termitomyces shrooms, a larger and a smaller species. There are several possible species that can grow from a termite nest, but within the nest, multiple species of the Termitomyces can start to grow, but they eventually start to compete with each other, until one becomes the dominant species raised by the given termite colony. I made sure to buy two species, and began to lay them out along the forest floor of Pandora. Godzilla was watching curiously from the mossy hill. What on earth is he doing? He thought. Some shrooms I left hanging onto plants. Based on last year's experimental trials, I learned that these shrooms should be releasing their spores within a few hours. I went up to Arcadia and collected leaf litter and debris and mixed them all in with the shrooms. For good measure, I also went out and collected a ton of leaf litter and scattered it along the forest floor. They probably may have already contained the spores from outside termite mushrooms, but I placed a bunch of shrooms on top of them to make sure a ton more spores would cover them. I also placed some of the shrooms into caverns of the driftwood. so spores would also fall into their outer fibers. And then, all was complete. Soon these mushrooms would release their spores to cover all this decaying plant material and wood, awaiting for the first termite workers to come along and eat the debris to start the fungus combs within their nests. What's incredible is that the fungus and the termites have a symbiotic relationship where one cannot live without the other in nature, and their life cycles are completely dependent on each other's success. I didn't know how long it would be before we could spot the foraging Macrotermes termites above ground, looking to eat the spore-laden debris. But regardless, I was prepared to succeed this year in growing these mushrooms. Little did I know, I would soon be celebrating on our mushroom growing journey. The mists blew through the lands, bringing a wave of humidity to the rainforest. This was awesome, as it would stimulate the mushrooms to release their spores even quicker. There was always something so mystical about the mists that blew through the rainforest, twice within a 24-hour period, and it was ultra relaxing to watch. The mist was also rising up through the glass bridge to bring humidity to Arcadia above. I find when the mists arrive, certain creatures come out of hiding to enjoy the humidified air. Spiders, particularly huntsmen, come out of hiding. Here's a juvenile, and back there is another. Here's another. Its abdomen was tickled by the webbing from another tiny spider there. Hi there, oh teenage huntsman. I also spotted another tiny spider close to it. The spiders seemed to be having a party. This tiny spider had captured a dwarf ant elate. I watched as the huntsman teenager began cleaning its legs. It then proceeded to clean its genitalia. Then more leg cleaning. All creatures of the rainforest need to be diligent at keeping as clean as possible, because in such a hot and humid environment, it's easy for bacterial or fungal infection to completely take over. Cleanliness is a sine qua non for Pandoran living. Speaking of fungus and the creatures of Pandora, I already started to notice the animals emerging to take advantage of the new shroom buffet available to them. The gnome ants excitedly rushed back to their nest, carrying pieces they had picked off the shrooms. How I loved watching their trails snake through the lands on a major collection operation. The ants particularly loved the gills, where the spores come from. It comes to show you how tasty these mushrooms are, that they're loved by humans, the termites, and ants. Eventually, the rains came, followed by the winds, which would help further distribute the spores. And lo and behold, I was about to make the coolest discovery by night. Night fell in Pandora, and the rainforest's night creatures had come out to play. The roaches were now taking their turn at munching down on the shrooms. The gnome ants were still active as ever, collecting bits of shrooms to store in their nest to feed on. And as I looked closer at the shrooms, I rejoiced when I saw the awesome white powder coating the leaf litter below the gills. See it? The spores were now releasing from the mushrooms. The plan was working. Yay! You know, I find that when caring for nature, there are often certain moments where I'm just left in sheer awe at watching Mother Nature just do her thing. And to think that something as simple as some spores spilling out of a mushroom cap, which to most people would be the most boring event in the universe, to us, who understand how critical such an event is for both the Termitomyces mushroom species and the termites that have been farming them for millions of years, is truly just a miracle to witness. And it was exciting to know that somewhere below the soils of Pandora were chambers full of termite workers waiting to burst forth up to the surface to eat the spore-covered debris so they could start building their fungus combs made from their poop. I couldn't wait for the day this would happen. But guys, you won't believe what I saw the next morning. By morning, I spotted some isopods of various colors, just devouring some of the new debris and leaf litter. Isopods are some of the forest's most efficient detritivores, breaking down organic material back into the soils. I wondered though, what if the isopods were so thorough that they consumed all the debris and leaf litter, which was supposed to be fuel for the termites' fungal gardens? I began to wonder if the spores could survive passing through the digestive systems of detritivores like isopods. Maybe the spores somehow benefit from passing through the digestive systems of certain detritivores, where it can be digested by the termites afterward. My previous attempts to get Termitomyces growing failed, and it could be that I was missing certain players in the process. It was something worth researching, since there is still so much we don't know about the Termitomyces process. Most of the mushrooms had been reduced to circles of slime in the leaf litter all around the forest floor. It didn't take very long for these mushrooms to decay and become food to other creatures. But as I began to scan the soils for mushroom remains, what I spotted next was the best sight I could possibly behold. Termites. What? No way! Yes way! Huge, healthy termite workers, foraging for you-know-what, the good stuff. Spore-flavored detritus, which was all ready for the termites to consume. These workers now had to do their best to select the right decaying plant material to eat. I don't know if they could smell which material had spores on them, but to be honest, I'm sure the tiny invisible spores had covered all exposed surfaces of the vivarium by now, that no matter what they ate, they'd be ingesting it. It was totally insane to watch this termite worker foraging above ground during the day, despite predators like Snip lurking around. It was hyper-focused on one important job right now, a job that would mean survival for its colony. And of course I cheered the termites on, because one day, if all goes well, and the termites succeed at getting their fungus combs growing underground, and hopefully, unlike my past year's attempts, manage to keep the fungus combs alive using resources and conditions of our rainforest, we'll one day be spotting a huge termite mound growing in Pandora. And maybe, just maybe, at the next rainy season, Termitomyces mushrooms would be sprouting in Pandora, and we would have therefore achieved something truly huge. And in my mind, eating that first Termitomyces mushroom we grew indoors, the termites grew indoors, would be the ultimate shroom trip of a lifetime. Besides mushrooms and termites, I was surprised to discover that the typhoon that had passed had caused other life forms to wake up from their long underground slumbers In my home, I have several houseplants, all of which came from outdoor nurseries. And just like in Pandora, I began to spot some totally amazing creatures that were introduced into my home by way of the plants that I just couldn't wait to add into our rainforest. AC family, I'm pleased to present to you Beyonce and Jay-Z. Vote in my community tab to affect this story.